We now understand that a service container is literally a container for any service in your application. So let's review how Laravel's container works. As it turns out, Laravel's container is actually the application itself, and we can access that using this app helper function. So I could say app, and just like before, I'm going to bind an example that will return whatever we need. So once again, let's create that example class. There we go. And let's new it up. All right, we now have a new key bound in the service container. Let's now fetch this quote-unquote service, and we can do it in a couple ways. In the last episode, we used this method called resolve. Well, as it turns out, there's a resolve helper function in Laravel. So if I say resolve the key called example, Laravel is going to look in the container. It'll see, yeah, I have something called example. Let's return what's bound to that. So we could do this, and then once again, I will dump that for your review. So if we switch to Firefox, sure enough, we fetched the instance. Very similar to the previous episode. Now let's say there's something special needed to build up this example instance. Maybe there's a service thing here. We'll just call it foo. This will be the value associated with it. Again, often these will be important settings or keys for your application. Let's say we need this key in order to instantiate example. This will need foo. I will create our constructor while accepting that as an argument. And we end up with something like that. Okay. Now, when we instantiate example, again, if we did it manually, we don't always want to read the config, find all the necessary parameters to construct this object. Instead, we'll declare what's needed one time. So we'll get our foo setting, and we can read any of these config files by providing the file name along with the key name. So the file name is services, the key is foo. Services.foo. Okay, so now we've fetched the configuration setting we need, and we've passed that to our example instance. So now, one more time, if I give it a refresh, you can see that we did read the config file, and that value was passed to our example instance. Okay, but now here is where it gets really cool. So let's bring it back to exactly what I had before, something very simple. Okay, like that. So once again, if I give it a refresh, we have our example instance. But now here's where it gets a little nutty. What if I didn't do this at all? And let's now change the key to a path to the class. So it would be app example, or you could say app example class. Okay, so now think about this. It's very strange. We know this is a fresh application, and we also know we haven't personally bound anything into the container that has that string. And yet, if I come back to Firefox and refresh, we still get it. Pretty interesting, right? But there's even more. Let's add a collaborator of some form. Again, this would represent anything, any dependency that example has. All right, we now have our collaborator. An example will depend on that. So let's instantiate that. And I'm going to type in, yeah, we need a collaborator here in order for this to work. So if I switch back and give it a refresh, that works as well. What's going on here? We told Laravel that we wanted an instance of example. So Laravel looked into its service container and it checked, all right, do we have anything for this key in the container? Because if so, that's definitely what you want. But it looked and it realized, no, there's nothing in there. So then it checked, is this an actual class? Are you trying to resolve an existing class in your application? And it checked, yeah, there is an example class. That's probably what they want. So it instantiates example. But then it reads the constructor arguments and it comes across this collaborator and it goes, okay, well now, in order for this object to be created, it needs a collaborator. So let's now look at collaborator. Is that something we can instantiate? And it continues this process for every argument. Is this something I can create? In this case, sure. There's no specifics, there's no configuration, there's no values that would need to be provided by the user. So it's very easy to instantiate this automatically. So it does. It creates a collaborator and it passes it into example automatically for you. And a quick note, I do understand if this is maybe a little confusing. Even if you understand what's happening here, from my experiences, people often fall off right around this lesson because they think to themselves, I don't know why I would ever use this. When would I need it? And the answer just comes from experience. The more you do it, the more you'll realize how useful this can be. But anyways, there's more. So if I go back to my routes file, here we are explicitly resolving example out of the container. Oh, and actually, by the way, I said we could use a resolve function, but if you want it to match what we have up here, you could also say, okay, give me the application instance, and then we're going to make this class. So you're going to get the exact same thing as before. They are functionally identical. Whatever you want. Okay, I just often use resolve. Anyways, this works, but now watch what happens if I simply ask for it. Okay, now I'm not explicitly resolving it out of the container. I'm just asking for it. Come back, refresh, and it still works. So this is the power of Laravel and the service container. And by the way, whether you're using route closures here or dedicated controllers, it's the same thing. In your action, you would request what you need. So if I were to, how about let's make a controller called pages controller. All right. And we replace this with, if you visit the home page, load the pages controller and the home action. All right, let's switch over there. We're going to have a home action. And once again, I'm going to request what I need. And once again, if I dump that, you will get the exact same thing. So I get it. Lots of new concepts here. Just stick around and I think it'll eventually click. Now we refer to this as automatic resolution. If it can, Laravel will automatically pass in what we need. However, there will be situations where to instantiate an object, you need something that Laravel cannot figure out on its own. So let's imagine we have some kind of foo thing here, and we haven't been explicit what that is. Well, think about it. Laravel is going to try to help you out here. It'll figure out, okay, you need a collaborator. It looks like I can instantiate collaborator. I got that. But then it's going to say, all right, well, you need foo. There's no type associated with it, so I can't inspect that. I don't know if foo is a string or a number or what. I can't help you here. So if we now try to run it, you're going to get a different exception. It's called binding resolution exception. So when you get this, it's Laravel's way of saying, I'm trying to resolve this out of the container for you, but I don't know how, and you haven't instructed me how. So it's situations like this when you need to be explicit. So this is where you would have something like this. You might say, okay, we're going to bind app example into the container. We will build up our collaborator, like so. And then we'll pass collaborator, and then foo would be equal to whatever is appropriate again. And there you go. So now we're being explicit about how to create example. So if I come back and refresh, now it works once again. So the key here is the order of operations. When in our controller, we tried to request example, to review that cycle one more time, Laravel checked, well, do we have something with that exact key already in the container? And in this case, the answer was yes. So it simply triggers this closure and returns the result. However, in the case where you haven't bound anything with that key, that's when it moves on to the next step. It moves on to, well, is this string here a class? And if so, let me see if I can build that up for them automatically. Okay, so I'm going to warn you, I still expect this to be confusing to you. I still expect you to think, well, I still don't really know why I would reach for this. And that's entirely par for the course at this point in your learning. I just need you to understand the general basics so that we can move on to things like Laravel facades and service providers. So I'm going to finish up by showing you where you might store this sort of logic. As we already noted, the typical location is a provider, and Laravel includes an app service provider for you out of the box. So right here, we're going to register any services in the service container. So let's just paste all of that in right there, and let's clean all this up like so. Okay, so once again, if I come back to Firefox, I still get the same thing because your app service provider has this logic. Finally, very last thing, we can fetch app in this way, or you have access to an app property on any provider. So if you take a look at this, you'll see you already have access to an application instance there. So we can instead do something like this, and that's fairly common. So if I come back, refresh, still the same thing. And the last piece of the puzzle Sometimes when you resolve something out of the container, you don't want a new instance every time. You want the same one. Not always, but there will be situations where a singleton is exactly what you want. So in those cases, ask for a singleton. And with this, no matter how many times you resolve example, you will get the exact same example instance. So if we go back to Pages controller, so real quick, if I were to resolve app example, and let's actually do it twice. Okay, so if I switch over, you'll see I get the exact same example object, 253. However, if I go back to the service provider and we only used bind there, each time you resolve it, it will construct a new object. You're not getting a singleton there. So here you see 253, 256 to represent that they are different instances. All right, so good job. We covered a lot of ground there. I fully expect it to be confusing. And if it's not, you're ahead of the pack. So in the next episode, let's move on to Laravel facades.